Lakota chief was carrying a shame from the last war. A white witness cleared him and was wed. The rope was still tied to the post where they'd left my horse. That's what I remember first when I think back on it. Not the faces at the hearing. Not the paper they pushed across the table with their ink still wet. The rope, gray and fraying at one end where the gelding had worked it for 3 days waiting on me, and when I finally came out of that building and walked across the yard to him, he pressed his nose against my collarbone and blew out a long breath, like he'd been holding it. I had been holding mine for 2 years. My name is Lakota Horses. I was 48 years old when the Army brought me in on that charge, and I was 50 when the thing finally broke open and let in air. In between is what I want to tell you about, not the war, not the politics of it, not what the newspapers made of it. Those are other men's stories, and they never got it right anyway. What I want to tell you is what it costs a man to carry a thing he did not do, and what it feels like when someone who had no reason in this world to stand up for him stands up anyway. I'll start where the shame started, because you can't understand what she gave me unless you understand what had been taken. The battle people called Willow Creek, we called something else, and neither name matters now. What matters is what happened at the north end of it, in the gray hour before the light came up right, when my band of 31 men had been riding since the night before on a cold that got into your chest and stayed. We were not supposed to be there. We were supposed to be already south, already across the river, because a runner had come 4 days earlier with word that the Army column was moving west, not north, and my uncle, who was leading the main body of our people, had said to me, "Take the young men south, keep them clear. I don't want blood today." He was 71 years old and he had seen enough blood to last 10 of his lifetimes, and I respected him, and so I went south and I kept them clear. Except the column wasn't moving west. 2 scouts I trusted told me different things in the same hour, which meant one of them was lying or one of them was wrong, and by the time I sorted out which the ground told me, you read ground the way another man reads print, the column was already swinging north and there was a family of Oglala camped in a creek bottom directly in its path. Not warriors, not even close. An old man, 2 women, 4 children, and a boy of about 14 who was his grandson. They had a cook fire and they had not heard anything yet, and the creek walls were high enough on both sides that they wouldn't until the horses were right above them. I had 31 men. The column had close to 200. I did not attack the column. What I did was ride down into that creek bottom and get those people up and moving. We put the children on horses. We put the old man behind Chayton because Chayton had the strongest horse, and we moved. We moved hard. We were in those creek walls and then out the far side and into the broken ground to the east before the column's advance riders crested the ridge. I know this because I was the last one out and I turned and looked and I could see them up there, 3 riders, and they were looking at the smoke from that abandoned cook fire, not at us. Nobody shot at us. We did not shoot at anybody. 7 miles east, when I was sure we were clear, I let the horses blow and I counted my people. 31 men, 7 from the creek bottom, 38 total. The 14-year-old boy was shaking so hard I could hear his teeth. I gave him my blanket. That is the entirety of what happened at Willow Creek from my side. What the Army report said was different. The Army report said that a Lakota war party under the leadership of Lakota Horses had engaged an advanced scouting element of the column at Willow Creek, killing 2 men, Corporal James Aldridge and Private Thomas Reardon, and wounding a 3rd before withdrawing east. The report said I led it. The report had my name. It had witnesses. It had, supposedly, a man who saw my face. I did not kill those men. I was 7 miles east when they died. For a long time I didn't know they were dead at all. The news came to me sideways, the way bad news usually travels. I heard it from a trader first, then from a Cheyenne rider who passed through, and by then there was already paper with my name on it circulating at the forts. I knew what that meant. I had seen other men run from paper with their names on it, and I had seen what running meant. It meant guilt. It meant they could hunt you forever. It meant your family was never safe. So I did something some people told me was stupid, and some people told me was the only honorable thing. I turned myself in. That was in the early part of the year. They held me at Fort Carson for 6 months before anything resembling a formal proceeding happened. I had a place to sleep and food, which was better than some things I'd known, but the walls were close and the days were long, and there is a particular kind of tired that comes from knowing you are innocent and not being believed. It settles in your bones different than regular tired. Regular tired you sleep off. That kind you carry. The man who said he saw my face was a corporal named Brent Sugden, and he was still with the column, and he told his story the same way every time, calmly, plainly, without hesitation. And it was wrong, but it was wrong in ways that were hard to attack because he believed it himself. He had seen a Lakota man leading a group of riders away from that creek bottom right before 2 of his fellow soldiers were shot. He had fixed on a face. In the confusion of gray light and distance and the sound of the rifles going off somewhere behind him, that face had become certain in his memory. He wasn't lying. He was wrong. There is a difference, and it doesn't help you much. The army wanted the matter closed. They had the report, and they had Corporal Sugden, and they had my name on paper. What they didn't have, what I had said from the first day, over and over, until my throat was raw with saying it, was a single other person who could account for where I was when those 2 men died. Chayton was dead by then. He'd gotten sick that winter. The rest of my 31 men were scattered in ways that made them hard to find and harder to bring before a military proceeding without putting them in danger. I had their names, but names weren't testimony. I needed a person willing to stand in a room full of soldiers and say, I was there. I saw him. He was not at Willow Creek. I was close to giving up on finding that person. Not giving up on living, I want to be clear about that, but giving up on the idea that the truth had any road left to travel. Some truths just get buried. Some lies get headstones and people leave flowers. I was preparing myself to face that. Then came the woman. Her name was Margaret Aldridge. The corporal who died, James Aldridge, was her husband's younger brother. She had been a widow herself for 3 years by the time I met her, her husband having died of a fever one rough winter on the homestead they tried to make work east of the fort. She had stayed on because there was nowhere better to go, which is a reason more people stay places than will ever admit it. She kept the homestead running with help from a hired hand and her own 2 hands, and she had, at some point in the previous 2 years, become a kind of informal nurse to the fort's small community. Not employed, not credentialed, just a woman who'd read her husband's medical books because there was nothing else to read, and who had a steadiness about her in hard moments that made people bring her their hard moments. I did not know any of this when I first saw her. What I saw was a woman standing in the doorway of the building where they kept me, about 40 feet away from where I was in the yard being walked back from a meeting with the colonel, and she was looking at me. Not the way people usually looked at me in that place. Not the sizing up look, not the cautious look, not the look that wants to find something frightening. She was looking at me the way you look at a problem you have been working over in your head for a long time and have not quite solved. I noticed that. The next time I saw her was 3 days later when she came to the building where I was being held and asked, through the guard, whether she could speak with me. The guard was a young man from somewhere east of the Mississippi who had opinions about these things that he was not quiet about, and what she said to him, I could not hear the words, but I could see the set of her, was enough to make him step aside. She came in and sat down across a small table from me and put her hands flat on it, and she said, without any preamble at all, I need to ask you some questions about what happened at Willow Creek, and I need you to tell me the truth, because I believe the report is wrong and I intend to find out. That was the first thing she said to me, not a greeting, not her name, that. I told her my name and asked for hers. She gave it, And then she said her brother-in-law was one of the men who died that day. I want you to understand what that meant. This woman's family had lost someone in that fight. The easiest thing in the world, the comfortable thing, the thing that fit the story already built, was for her to believe I had done it. Most people would have believed it. Most people would have needed to believe it because it closed the wound in a way that staying open didn't. She was not most people. I said to her, "Why do you think the report is wrong?" She said, "Because I was there." I held very still when she said that. There is a kind of stillness that is not calm. It is the opposite of calm. It is everything in you going quiet to hear better. That was the stillness I had. I had been in that place for 6 months and not one person, not one single voice, had put those words in that order in my direction. I was there. She had been traveling with the column. Her brother-in-law, the corporal, James, had arranged for her to ride along for part of the column's movement west, because he worried about her being alone on the homestead through the hardest part of winter, and she had gone, and she had been in the supply wagons at the column's rear on the morning of the engagement at Willow Creek. She had heard the shots. She had gone forward, which was not the thing she was supposed to do, but she did it anyway, and she had arrived at the scene within 15 minutes of the shots being fired. And she had done what she always did in hard moments, which was look around her clearly and carefully and remember what she saw. What she saw was 2 dead soldiers, a wounded third, and 3 men not from my band, not Lakota at all by her assessment, though she was careful to say she couldn't be completely certain, already disappearing north on horses. She had tended the wounded man for 40 minutes while the column got organized to pursue. She had spoken to Corporal Sugden before he gave his statement to the officers. She had watched Sugden in the gray light pointing northeast and saying he saw who led it, and she had thought, even then, he didn't see clearly enough for that certainty. He was too far. The light was wrong. She had not said so at the time because she was a woman with a dead brother-in-law, and no one was going to hear her say anything that complicated in that moment. But she had kept the memory. And then she heard my name attached to the event, and she went looking. She had spent, she told me, about 8 months looking. Not looking for me, looking for what actually happened. She had ridden back out to that country. She had talked to the trader who traveled those routes. She had found a Cheyenne man who had been in those hills that day and who would not talk to her at first and then, after 3 visits, did. He had told her about the Oglala family in the creek bottom. He had told her about the Lakota riders who came and took them out east. He had described the man leading them, older, broad across the shoulders, a gray horse. I had ridden a gray horse that day. Chayton's horse had been a black, and she had found a man who remembered Chayton's black horse and the man riding it. She had a name, she had a route, she had a direction. And then she had found out that I had already turned myself in, and she had come to Fort Carson. And now she was sitting across a small table from me with her hands flat on it, telling me things I had been waiting 2 years for someone to tell me. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "You went out there on your own." She said, "Someone had to." I said, "Your brother-in-law died in that fight." She said, "I know, and the men who killed him are still out there because the wrong man is in here." She didn't say it with heat. She said it the way a person states a fact about the weather or the state of offense. This is how it is. She had made her peace with what it cost, and she was past the grief part of the decision, into the doing part. I had to look away for a moment. There was a crack in the wall of that room that I had looked at many times over 6 months, a horizontal crack about 8 inches long at eye height if you were standing. I looked at it now. I was not going to let this woman see me come apart over something she'd said plainly and meant plainly and deserved to have received plainly. I said when I trusted my voice, "What do you need from me?" And she said, "I need to know exactly where you were and who was with you and what you saw. I need times. I need names. I need everything you haven't been able to get anyone to listen to." So I told her. It took most of the afternoon. She had a small book, one of those narrow ones that fit in a coat pocket, and she wrote in it in a tight hand that I couldn't read upside down but that never seemed to stop moving. She asked good questions. The kind of questions that aren't filling in a story you've already decided on, but the kind that are actually trying to find what happened. She asked about the scouts who gave me conflicting information. She asked about the creek walls and the sight lines and the distance to the ridge. She asked about the cook fire, how long had it been burning, how much wood was left, could a column rider have seen it from the ridge and known people had been there recently. She was building something, I could see that. She was building an account that could stand up in a room. After a while one of the guards came in to tell her time was up, and she looked at him with an expression that I would come to know well over the following months. An expression that communicated without using any words that she was in the middle of something and did not intend to stop. And the guard, a man of about 22, left without saying anything further. When she had what she needed, she closed the book and sat quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I won't make you any promises." I said, "I know." She said, "I know some people, army people, one of them might listen. If I can get the Cheyenne man to speak, and I think I can, I think I know how to approach him, and if Corporal Sugden can be made to see that his certainty was the light and the distance, and not what he actually saw clearly enough to swear to, there may be a hearing." I said, "There is already supposed to be a hearing." She said, "A real one." She stood up then and pulled her coat on, and I noticed, this is the kind of detail you notice and don't know why until much later, that one button was missing from the middle of the coat and she had replaced it with a piece of laced leather. It was a small thing. It was so particular that it stayed in me. That coat. She walked to the door and then turned back. She said, "Mr. Mannyhorses, I want to tell you something. Not as a matter of the proceeding, not as a witness or an investigator or whatever you want to call me. As a person." I waited. Said, "My brother-in-law was a kind man who did not deserve what happened to him, and I have been angry about it. I have been angry enough about it that for the first few months after I heard your name I was not thinking clearly, because it was easier to have a place to put the anger. And then I started to think. And when I think clearly, I know that what I saw and what the report says do not match, and a kind man who died in that fight would not have wanted an innocent man to pay for it." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she left. I sat in that room for a long time after she was gone, with the crack in the wall and the gray light coming through the one high window, and for the first time in 2 years I breathed from the bottom of my lungs. What followed was 4 months more of waiting, and I will not make those months sound better than they were. There were days so flat and still they felt like they were pressed under something. There were nights where the certainty that she had given me, that someone in the world knew, started to feel like the one live coal in a dead fire, and I cupped it and I held it and I told myself, "She is out there. She went on her own before anyone asked her to. She is not the kind of woman who starts something and then leaves it." She came back twice in those months. Both times to the room with the table, both times with her book. Once she brought coffee, which startled the guard enough that I almost laughed. The second time she came, she told me she had met again with the Cheyenne man. His name was Rides Far, which is not the name I'll give here, but that was the sense of it, and he had agreed to speak at the proceeding. He would not come to the fort, and nobody was going to compel him to, but he would speak to a civilian commissioner if one could be found, and she had found one. A retired Army judge named Beaumont, who was known for being the kind of man who actually read what was put in front of him. She also told me she had sat with Corporal Sugden. I asked how that went. She paused before she answered, which told me something. Then she said, "He is not a dishonest man. I don't think he ever set out to accuse the wrong person. But I think he knows, somewhere he knows, that what he saw was not what he said he saw. He saw a man on a gray horse leading riders away. He put a face to that man because he needed to, because his friends were dead and he needed a face." She said, "I told him about the cook fire and the family in the creek bottom. I told him what the Cheyenne man saw. I don't know if he'll change his statement, but I think I put something in him that wasn't there before." She was right. He didn't change his statement entirely. But at the hearing he said, and this was enough, as it turned out, that in the conditions of that morning in that light at that distance, he could not swear with absolute certainty to the face. He could swear to the gray horse. He could swear to the direction. He could not swear to the face. It was a small thing for him to say. It was a very large thing for me. The hearing was held in a room at Fort Carson on a morning in late fall when the air outside had that first real cold in it, the kind that means the cold that is coming is serious. Commissioner Beaumont sat at the head of a table that ran the length of the room. On one side were 3 Army officers, one of whom was the colonel who had been running things for 2 years and who did not appear to be enjoying himself. On the other side was a man from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whose role was unclear to me and remained so. At the far end of the table was a chair that was mine. They brought me in and sat me down, and the first thing I did was look around the room for Margaret Aldridge. She was against the back wall, standing. There were benches there for people who had come to observe, and the benches were occupied by perhaps 15 people, most of them Army, and she was standing behind the last bench with her hands clasped in front of her and that coat with the leather lace button, and she was looking at me with an expression I could not quite read, but that was not afraid. I nodded to her, she nodded back. What happened over the next several hours was not dramatic in the way people imagine these things. There were no raised voices. There was no moment of sudden revelation. The commissioner read statements. He asked questions in a flat, thorough way that reminded me of a man checking fence line, working along methodically, pressing each post to see if it was firm. Corporal Sugden testified and said what he said. The written account of Rides Farr, who had given his statement to Beaumont at a location east of the fort some weeks earlier, was read into the record. I answered questions for about an hour and a half. And Margaret Aldridge testified. She stood where she had been standing against the back wall and answered questions about what she had seen and when and from how far. She answered questions about her relationship to Corporal Aldridge, and she answered them directly and without flinching. And the colonel asked her why, given her connection to the matter, she had gone to the lengths she had gone to, and she said, and I remember the exact words because I have carried them since, because being connected to something doesn't mean you stop being responsible for seeing it clearly. And I saw it clearly. The colonel looked at her for a moment, and then wrote something on the paper in front of him. Beaumont took about 20 minutes at the end. He went through the points in a quiet voice that the room stayed quiet to hear. The evidence did not support the conclusion that Lakota Manihorses was present at the engagement at Willow Creek. The physical evidence and the testimony of multiple witnesses placed him 7 miles east. The original account was based on an identification made under conditions not adequate to support the certainty with which it was given. The charge was to be dismissed. He didn't say it with any ceremony. He read it off the paper in front of him, and then turned the paper over and asked if there were any procedural matters. There weren't. When I walked out of that building, the cold hit me different than it had going in. The gelding was tied to the post where they'd put him that morning, and I went to him and stood with my hand on his neck for a moment, just feeling the warmth of him. He put his nose against my ribs. I had been in those walls for 22 months. I had gone in late winter, and here was late fall, and the smell of the air was clean, in a way I had stopped noticing it was missing. I heard the door behind me, and I knew the step without turning around. She came and stood beside me, not in front of me, not at an angle, beside me, looking at what I was looking at, which was the open ground to the west going golden in the low light. She said, "I'll get Rides Farr a message that it's done." I said, "Thank you." We stood there for a moment. The gelding lifted his head and looked at her, and then went back to the dry grass near the post. I said, "What you did going out there, finding Rides Farr, going back a 3rd time. I stopped because I wasn't sure I had the right words. Then I said, "A man spends 2 years being told that what he knows about himself is wrong. What it does to you, what it does to the inside of you, I don't know if I can explain that. And what you did was say, 'I know what I saw and it wasn't that, and I'm going to say so.'" She didn't say anything immediately. The wind moved through the dried grass near the fence. Then she said, "You would have done it." I said, "I hope so." She said, "You turned yourself in when you didn't have to." I said, "That wasn't courage. That was knowing what running costs." She made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a disagreement or might have been just the cold. Then she said, "What will you do now?" I hadn't let myself think past the hearing. I'd been so careful not to think past it that the question landed on something unprepared. I said, "Go south, see what's left." I had people south, or I had had people south. 2 years was a long time and things scattered. You. She said, "The homestead." A pause, "Though the hired man has been unreliable." I turned and looked at her then. Full on. She was looking at the western light and her profile was steady and not asking me anything, just stating a fact. I said, "Is a bad country." She said, "It's good country. It's just too much for one person." I said nothing. She said nothing. The gelding blew out another long breath. Eventually she looked at me. I want to try to say this right. The look she gave me, it wasn't the look of a woman doing a man a favor. It wasn't pity. It wasn't the particular kind of warmth that people aim at someone they've helped, which is a warmth that still has some distance in it, some separation. What she gave me was a look of plain recognition, the way you look at something you have come to know well and which you are not done knowing. There was steadiness in it. There was something that hadn't been there when she first walked into that room with her book. I said, "Show me the land." She said, "All right." We rode east on the third day after the hearing. I had spent 2 days settling things, sending word south to what family I could reach, collecting what was mine. She rode a brown mare that was calm and sensible and covered ground without complaint, and I had the gelding, and we took the route that passed through the creek country north of the homestead because she wanted to show me the water situation. The land opened up as we rode. I had not been out in open land for 22 months, and I had not realized, not fully, what the walls of that place had cost me until the walls were gone. The sky was very large and very blue, and far to the north there was a line of cloud that would become weather by evening but wasn't yet. The grass was gone to brown with the season, but you could see the shape of the ground under it, the way it held and rolled, and the dry creek beds that would run again in spring. She knew the land. She pointed things out as we rode, where the good grass would come back, where a second-season family of beavers had built a dam that changed the water on the lower parcel, where she'd lost 6 head the previous winter to cold she hadn't been prepared for, and what she would do differently. She talked about it the way someone talks about a thing they are in a serious relationship with attention and some frustration and an underlying commitment that was not going anywhere. I asked her questions about the soil, about the winters, about who her nearest neighbors were and whether they were any help. She answered them straight, no performance in it. We stopped at midday where a shallow ridge gave shelter from the wind, and she had packed food in the saddlebag, bread, dried meat, something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be an apple cut into sections and dried. We sat with the horses ground-tied nearby and ate. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said she could. She said, "At the hearing, after Beaumont read the decision, you walked out without looking at the colonel or the officers, but you looked at me." I said I did. She waited. I said, "I wanted to know if you were satisfied, if it came out as far as you needed it to come out." She thought about that, then she said, "And was I?" I said, "I think so, though I think there was still some anger in you." She said, "There will always be some anger. James is still dead, and whoever is responsible for that is still not held responsible for it. Beaumont's decision was right and it wasn't enough. Both things are true. I said, yes. She said, you understood that even then. I said, I understood you weren't going to be able to set it down all the way, that it doesn't work like that. She looked at me in that way she had, that way of looking at a thing clearly. She said, no, it doesn't. We finished eating. The horses grazed what they could find. The northern cloud was building, but we still had time. I stayed through the winter. Not in the house. I built a shelter near the barn that was warm enough, and I had slept in worse. She didn't ask me to come into the house, and I didn't offer to, because there was a right pace to what was between us, and neither of us wanted to push it. What we did was work. There was plenty of it. The fencing on the north parcel was in bad shape, the kind of bad shape that speaks to a hired man who treated the work the way you treat something you don't own. I spent 3 weeks on fence before the ground froze, working in the cold mornings while she did the stock, and in the afternoons we worked together, patching the roof of the second outbuilding, winterizing the root cellar, setting traps for the things that were getting into the grain. She was a good worker. Not in the way people mean when they say it with surprise about a woman. She was a good worker in the way a reliable person is a good worker, because she knew what needed doing and she did it, and she didn't make the work heavier than it was with complaint. When something frustrated her, she got quiet, not loud. When something went right, she got satisfied, not effusive. I learned how she was in the world by watching her work. That is the truest way I know to learn a person. In the evenings we sat by the fire, she in the house, me at the door or just inside it, depending on the weather, and talked about whatever came. Some nights it was the practical matters of the place. What seed she meant to put in come spring, whether the south meadow was worth the expense of irrigation, or whether the water flow was already sufficient in a good year. Other nights it went further back. She told me about her husband, not with grief anymore, more with a kind of honest accounting. This is who he was, and this is what we had, and this is what I miss. And she asked me about my life before the war, and I told her what I was willing to tell, which was more than I'd told most people and less than everything. I told her about my wife, who had died 8 years earlier. She asked how, and I told her sickness in a bad winter, the kind that comes fast and doesn't leave much time for anything. She said she was sorry and she meant it, and that was all she said about it, which was the right amount. One night in the deep cold of January, she came out to where I was working on a harness by lamplight in the barn, and she sat on a hay bale and watched me for a while and then said, "Do you think about going south still?" I said, "Some." She said, "And?" I said, "And I'm still here." She was quiet for a moment. The lamplight moved a little in a draft. She said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly." I looked at her. She said, "I didn't ask you here as a kind of repayment. I know that it might look like that. I helped you, and then I asked you here and you came, but that's not what this is." I said, "I know that." She said, "I'm asking because I want you here. Because what I saw at that hearing and in those months before it is a man I want to know more of, and because this land is—" She stopped and then started again. "This land is a serious thing. It needs serious people, and you are one." I put the harness down. I said, "Margaret." She said, "Yes." I said, "I came because I wanted to come, not because I owed you anything, not because I had nowhere else, because you walked into that building and put your hands flat on a table and said, 'I intend to find out,' and a man who has not had someone in his corner in a long time." I stopped. She said quietly, "I know." I said, "I came because of you, not the land." She didn't look away. And there was something she did then that I did not expect. She reached across the space between us and put her hand against the side of my face. Just held it there. Warm palm, cold fingertips, looking at me like she was making sure of something she had mostly already made sure of. I put my hand over hers. She said, "All right then." We married in the spring. Not at the fort. Neither of us had any business at the fort anymore. There was a settlement 20 miles east where a preacher came through 4 times a year, and we rode out on a bright cold morning in April when the mud had dried enough to travel, and we married in a building that was simultaneously a church and a meeting hall, and occasionally a place to store grain, depending on what the season required. Her neighbor, a woman named Hattie Poole who had grown up in Missouri and had opinions about most things but kept them mostly to herself, came as a witness. Rides Far had sent word through a trader that he wished us well, which was more than enough. The preacher was a small man with a large voice who performed the ceremony with a briskness that suggested he had somewhere else to be, which he probably did. And when it was over, he shook my hand with a firmness that was either genuine warmth or the professional variety, and I didn't much care which. We rode home in the late afternoon, with the light going long and amber across the land, and Margaret rode the brown mare and I rode the gelding, and the mud on the road had dried in the day's warmth, and the horses were glad to be moving. She said at some point, not looking at me but with something in her voice that was lighter than her usual, "Hattie will talk." I said, "Hattie has already talked." She laughed at that, a real one. She didn't laugh often enough that it became something you didn't notice. When she laughed, you noticed it. The land opened up around us as we got farther from the settlement. My land now too, I supposed, though it would take a while before I said it that way in my head. Hers first, then the work we were making of it together, then mine in the way that things that are built side by side become shared. We came up over the last rise before the homestead, and she pulled up the mare for a moment, and I pulled up beside her. Below us was the house, and the barn and the fencing I had spent weeks on in the cold, and the south meadow where the grass was just starting to come back, and beyond it the dry creek that would run in the next rain, and beyond that the land going on until the sky came down to meet it. She said, "Worth it?" I said, "Yes." She looked at me. That look again. No calculation in it, no performance. Just her looking at me and seeing me and not moving her eyes away from what she saw. I had carried a false thing in my bones for 2 years, and there were days still, I won't pretend otherwise, when I felt the shape of where it had been, like a healed break that knows when rain is coming. But sitting on that rise with the evening light on the land and that woman beside me who had gone out looking for the truth when no one asked her to, and had found it, and said it in a room full of people who didn't want to hear it. Sitting there, I understood that whatever the weight of those 2 years had cost me, I was being paid back in something worth more. A man who has had his dignity dragged through the ground and had to sit still for it, and then has someone hand it back to him plain and clean, not as charity, but as just the simple fact of what is true, that man knows a thing about value that comfortable men do not. She had seen what I was. She had said so in a room. And then she had ridden east with me in the cold, and I had fixed her fence, and she had handed me that apple, and now here we were on this rise with the evening behind us. The gelding moved under me and settled. She said, "Come on then." We rode down.